for that. It's a very stimulating opening, and I think Anthony has started a debate which was inevitable, and which I think is important for those of us to respond to. I think that one of the strange things about being a liberal Zionist in the American Jewish space is that you spend much more of your intellectual energy, if you were involved in the Jewish community at all, as Mir and I are, arguing with people to your right. Even though I think in many ways, the more important and interesting debates are often with people to your left. And so I think, I think Anthony's done something good by bringing, and Sam by bringing that up. So let me I guess start with the place where I agree. The concepts of liberalism and the concept of Zionism, are in tension. I don't see how they could not be in tension. Liberalism is a universal ideology. It believes in a politics that prioritizes the idea that people have liberty, that people have certain rights, freedoms that are protected from the state, whether it's freedoms of assembly, worship, conscience, etc. Modern liberals may believe that you need a welfare state for people to have the kind of the social goods to be able to access those freedoms. But either way, the point is that these are universal ideas. Zionism is not a universal idea. It's a particular idea. It's a national idea. It's the national self-determination of the Jewish people, and it speaks about realizing the aspirations and safeguarding the rights of a particular group. So it seems to me there's an inevitable tension between liberalism and Zionism. But that tension is not unique to the tension between liberalism and Zionism. I mean, there's also tension between civil liberties and national security, or environmental protection and economic development. And I, as a liberal who also has particular commitments, feel that tension in many ways. I mean, there's a tension between my liberalism and my Americanism when I say I want more of the American national budget to go to Americans than to go to poor people in the developing world. There's a tension. There's a tension between my liberalism and my my connection to my family when I want more of my family's budget to go to my own children than to other children. There's a tension between myself as a liberal and myself as a Jew when I say that I would prefer my children marry another Jew. I mean, that is a serious offense towards liberal values, as many American liberal non-Jews will quietly tell you they feel it is. So this tension is not unique to my Zionism. Now, it does have special character because of Zionism, because of course the illiberalism of the Beinart family, we're not a state, we don't have an army, we don't have a flag, right? And the tension that I feel between my liberalism and my Americanism is somewhat different, because America is not a country that, at least formally, privileges any ethnic or religious group. So I'm not suggesting that it's the same kind of tension, only just to stipulate that there can be tension between various different things that one both believes are important. In an ideal world, I would be highly sympathetic to the idea of a world in which no countries privilege any ethnic or religious group. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that we don't live anywhere near that world. There are many countries in Europe that have crosses on their flags. There are many countries in the Middle East that have crescents on their flags. There are many countries in Europe that we would all agree to be democracies that have privilege, that have immigration policies that privilege members of one ethnic group. And according to the Palestinian Constitution, as of 2003, the Palestinian Constitution says, Islam will be the official religion of a Palestinian state, and Sharia will be the main source of legislation, even though that document also talks about freedom of religion. So it seems to me that's actually a version of the very tension imagined in a Palestinian state that we are recognized also exists in a Jewish state. So the tension is inevitable, but it seems to me there's a certain amount of tension, for me at least, speaking personally, that is too much tension. So in order to understand how much tension one is willing to accept, speaking personally, you first have to answer the question of how much one values Zionism, right? How much value do I place on the idea of a Jewish state? And for me, the answer is I place a significant amount of value on it. First of all, because I think that the cultural Zionist project, the project of recreating a Jewish population in the land of Israel, building Hebrew as a living language, all of the cultural expression, I think has been of immense value to Jews around the world. And I think without the hard shell of a Jewish state, I think there are significant questions about whether that population could remain with anywhere near the vitality it has. Secondly, I place some significant value on Zionism because I believe that in a post-Holocaust world, I'm attached to the idea that there is a country that has the survival of Jewish life, the protection of Jewish life as its mission statement. And sees that as part of its responsibility. There is one such state in the world. Now that said, just because I place some value on Zionism doesn't mean that I would accept a Zionism or a Jewish state at all costs. If the Jewish state offered no citizenship to non-Jews, if it offered no voting rights to non-Jews, then I think I would be forced to say, tragically, that even though I value the idea of a Jewish state quite a bit, I think that would be too high a price for me to pay. Not for many, many other people I know, many other people in my own shul, in my extended family, but for me it would be too high a price to pay. And it's because it's too high a price to pay that I feel myself to be in fundamental opposition to Israeli control of the West Bank, where Palestinians lack citizenship and the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. So in my ideal world, what I would want to do would be to minimize that tension, to limit that tension, with a kind of a thin Zionism that would be stripped to its essential character, which is essentially, to me, the idea of a refuge for Jews in distress, the idea of an obligation to Jews in distress. For me personally, speaking from my version of liberal Zionism, whatever that is, everything else is negotiable in the interests of a state that offers more equality to its 20% Palestinian citizens, and that would include even things that I feel personally quite attached to, like the flag and the national anthem, not to mention a whole series of laws that discriminate against Israel's Palestinian citizens. And I think that I can justify that form of thin Zionism, even recognizing that there's still a tension with liberalism, especially in the context where there is a Palestinian state. Because as I said before, I expect that you will see that same tension in a Palestinian state, that the Palestinian state will have Palestinian symbols, and that it will certainly have a Palestinian right of return. And I think that is why a Palestinian state is very important to actually the project of helping to limit, I don't think you can eradicate, but limit the tension between liberalism and Zionism. Now, I think Anthony and many other people I respect would say, well, Beinart, that might be fine in your ideal world, but it bears no relationship to reality on the ground, so you're just whistling Dixie here. And I think it's certainly true that I think that the political trends in Israel, certainly under this Israeli government, and even before that, have been moving in the other direction. But for me, to disregard, to abandon the project of trying to bring liberalism and Zionism into a greater harmony, recognizing they will never be in full harmony, first of all requires me to disregard the concern I have for the protection of Jewish life that a Jewish state offers, which to me, especially in an era of rising anti-Semitism now, is something that I'm unwilling to abandon. But secondly, it requires me, and I think this is what Anthony didn't say in his opening talk, although I'm sure he has thoughts about it, it does require me, it seems to me, to begin to think and have ideas about the alternative, which is to say, I'm enough of a conservative to believe that if you're going to tear something down, if you're going to get rid of Zionism as an ideology, which practically means kind of the dismantling of the Israeli state, you have to have thought a bit, and you have to have some ideas about what's going to come after, and you have to have thought about how practical they are. The most common suggestion would be a secular binational state. But a secular binational state does not have a great track record. I mean, it barely works in Belgium. The Czechs and the Slovaks couldn't make it work together in a far more placid environment. And it seems to me that for people who want to practically imagine what happens once you abandon the idea of liberal Zionism, and imagine a secular binational state, maybe that's not how Anthony formulates it, but I think that's the most common formulation, it seems to me you have to answer this question. In a one-state solution, let's call it, with no religious or ethnic identity, let's call it Israelstein, right? One thing we know is that you're going to have massive, massive land claims, right? If you think the practical problems of getting rid of settlers from the West Bank is difficult, the problems expand dramatically when you basically have the entire state up for grabs for a Palestinian population who will want to try to return to all of Israel, and they have fees and land claims. And so you're going to have situations where you have Palestinians who say, this place where Moroccan Jews have lived since 1953 is on the ruins of my village. In Israelstein, you're going to have to be able to imagine you can have a Jewish judge who rules to evict that Moroccan family. and then the joint Palestinian-Jewish brigade of Israelstein is going to go to evict that family, and when the shots start ringing out, it's going to hold together because of the greater loyalty that they have to Israelstein rather than being Jewish or Palestinian. It just seems to me that even if one believes that that would be a great outcome one day, we are nowhere near that today. That the reason that people moved towards the idea of partition, which legitimized the Jewish state in the 1930s and 40s, was precisely because of the prospect of civil war. And it seems to me that civil war is what Israelstein would be under a common flag. It would be rival militias under a common flag. I mean, sadly, if one thing the Middle East has taught us over the past few years is that even terrible states, even states that I hope we could agree are far worse than Israel, can actually be replaced by even worse things in the form of state breakdown. So I'm unwilling, I'm unwilling at this point to give up on the idea of liberal Zionism, even recognizing there's a tension, even recognizing that it requires me to compromise my universalism, and recognizing that it's a lot easier for me to say that than for the person who I'm compromising it on behalf. I recognize that. I don't want to trivialize that claim, but it's because the particular value of a Jewish state is important to me, and because although I'm a pessimistic liberal Zionist, I'm even more pessimistic about the alternative to the two-state solution. And I want to quote one important politician in this conflict who shares this pessimism. He said recently, "If the two-state solution fails, the substitute will not be a binational one-state solution, but a persistent conflict that does not know any middle ground." That's Marwan Barghouti, the most popular Palestinian politician alive. It is still the case that the two-state solution, for all its terrible flaws, has much more political support on both sides of this divide than does the one-state alternative.